Hey everybody, welcome back to Digital Humanities. So what I'm going to do in this very short lecture is to provide some background for the assignment 2, and repeat some things that I tried to say in lecture during a very difficult, buggy session. So while this is not a programming class, and it's also not really like a web skills class, the assignment, which is aimed at getting you to understand the relationship between information and data, as it were, or between interpretation and data. The assignment works in an HTML framework, and so we can introduce or begin to grapple with some of the intellectual issues around presentation and interpretation by learning a tiny bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are the three languages of the modern web. So in this brief lecture, what I'm just going to do is explain what these things are and what the role of each language is in presenting web pages to you. So here's a little bit of rendered HTML. So it's just like what you might expect to find on a web page. It says this is the top level heading, this is a paragraph, it can contain further markup and also more complex content. Sometimes you'll see semantic tags like aside, etc. It's also permissible to make up your own tags. So that's just some text. When we look at it, though, the text is not all presented to us in the exact same manner. So this is the top level heading, is bolded with a large font. There is some italicized text and there is colored text, which when you look at that color, you know from your own experience that that is probably a link. So we're already seeing, even without having looked at any code or anything, the potential complexity of text in the web. And of course, you're familiar with it already. Here is the code that presents that text. And you can see, even without knowing really anything about HTML, you can start to see a structure. And so what you're going to want to do as a student in this class is understand that you're not going to be taught everything in a systematic way about the technologies that we use, because that would take a really long time, and this is just an introductory class. However, you might still be able to recognize patterns and make use of the patterns that you see to interpret what's going on. So here we see that every kind of semantically relevant textual element is delimited by these strange markings, which are angle brackets with some letters inside them. And what we notice is that at the beginning, there's a set of angle brackets with an H1, and at the end of the element is the same exact thing with the addition of a forward slash. So we have an H1 element here, a P element here, and an aside element here. Those are all standard HTML tags. It is now permissible to also make up your own tags in HTML, although that can be a little bit complicated, and there are some kind of gotchas with that in the assignment. But here are two that we use in the assignment: stanza and line. One thing you'll notice is that while the paragraph gets its own line and the aside gets its own line, the two lines inside the stanza do not get their own line. And we'll maybe explore that a little bit later in questions or something. So HTML differs from just plain text in that it is already semi-structured. Programs can scan the text and interpret it, and then treat it as data to combine, analyze, and also present to the reader. The point for you of learning HTML, I mean, there are many points potentially. One point is to understand how you would achieve a certain look, and you're going to need to be able to do that for the assignment. Another, though, sort of broader aim is to understand how a complex computer algorithm might treat this text as data. So on a web page, there are 3 levels, 3 technologies that control what you see. HTML provides structure and content to a web page. CSS is sometimes called the presentation layer. It controls how the structure is displayed. And JavaScript is used for making dynamic changes to the page. For instance, changing your feed, updating your feed over time. And especially we'll be thinking about this in a couple places through the class. It's used for manipulating and rendering remote data that comes from another place. So maybe the web page lives on one server, and then it's taking data from some other data source and rendering it. You're going to, in general, need to use JavaScript for that task. When we look at an HTML tag, just as we said before, we'll see some content surrounded by opening and closing tags. And the tags will look like this. There will be angle brackets to delimit the tag. The tag name, oops, and we're missing a crucial piece here, will be indicated at the beginning, and then there would be a forward slash missing from this image. Sorry about that. So you'll have the tag name at the beginning and at the end. The one thing that we didn't really show or talk about in the last little slide was that in the opening tag, in addition to the tag name, you can also have attributes and values. And those attribute value pairs, key value pairs, will often affect how the browser displays and interprets the tag. Sometimes they're mandatory in some tags, like with a link, it's mandatory, and other times they're optional and just add extra information. The only attribute that really matters for us for this assignment, for this exercise and assignment, is the class attribute, which will be set equal to 1 or more words. And each word is a class name that can be used especially by CSS. So let's talk about that now. Yeah, so the first layer, that's us talking about the first layer of HTML. We're not really going to learn a whole lot of HTML specifics. If you want to learn more about that stuff, you can always take my digital history class, or you can take lots of other classes to learn that material. We need to know a little tiny bit about CSS for the assignment. CSS, so HTML is a hypertext markup language. I didn't say that earlier. CSS is cascading style sheets. The idea of a style sheet comes from the publishing industry in the pre-web era, where when you submitted a text to a publisher, whether it was to a newspaper or to a scientific journal, or if you were writing a book, the publisher would provide you with a style sheet that told you what the rules were that you had to follow to in order to be published in the text, in the whatever, in the journal or whatever. The CSS language was developed, as it were, as a kind of computer substitute for those style sheets. And they're called cascading style sheets because one rule or style sheet definition can override prior values. And in particular, you can have rules for elements and also rules for other units, classes, and other things like IDs. And those more specific rules will override the basic rule for the element. So you can have a rule for all paragraphs and a rule for paragraphs with the class of special, and the special rule will override the main paragraph rule. So let's just take a look at what a CSS rule set looks like. you'll see when you look at a CSS file, it's divided into a bunch of stanzas like this. The stanzas are the thing I call them stanzas. Really, their name is selector statements, and each selector statement can also be called a rule set with a so they follow the same pattern. You have a selector at the beginning. So in the first one is h1, the second one is div, and then we notice they're a little bit more confusing as we continue. Div.main space p and hash special ID. Those are slightly more complex. But in any case, each thing at the beginning is called a selector. And then there will be a set of squiggly brackets of curly braces that delimit the rules that apply to the selector. So everything inside this first set of brackets of curly braces applies to all h1 elements. Everything inside these braces applies to all div elements, and everything inside these braces, this is a little bit complex, applies to every p element which is to be found inside a div element with the class of main. You don't really have to know that. I just want you to see that. And this one applies to every element, and there should only be one in a given page that has the ID of special ID. That's what the hash sign means there. So the hash means indicates ID, and the dot indicates class. So class of main. Each of the rules is a set of property value pairs, a key value statement, as we used that term before in the class. And each rule does something to the display of the text. So this set of rules ensures that h1 elements, first level headers, the font will be blue. The font family will be the serifed text, so it will have textual decorations, serifed decorations like little lines at the ends of the S's and at the bottom of the P and so forth. That's called a serif. And the font size will be 24 pixels, which is pretty big. Every div element will get a border. The border will be 1 pixel thick. It will be solid, and it will be colored black. And this special paragraph will be red, and this one will be floated left, which means it will move over to the left side of the text, and the rest of the text will kind of flow around it. It's not really that important for you to know. Anyway, so that's what CSS looks like, and CSS can be extremely complex. Here's what the New York Times looks like with and without CSS. So on the left side of the slide, you see, a rather complexly rendered page, and on the right side, you see garbage. So even though we say, sometimes you might think CSS is just for display, so really only the HTML matters. Actually, the New York Times is entirely uninterpretable without CSS. And so that display element is extremely important. And it's also like a clue to us intellectually as we think about text and media, that form matters immensely in the conveyance of information. And finally, we have the third layer, JavaScript, which is intended to add dynamic transformations to a web page. We can see some code, some really silly code here in this little example that I just clicked on. It walks you through creating this little button and indicates that when I click on the button, I get a pop-up that allows me to enter my name, and you can see that it changes from Chris to Matt there. You can follow that link if you like in the notes and check it out. We are not really learning to program in this class. but it helps to be aware of JavaScript, and we will fool around with it in class in the next couple of weeks. Okay, for this video, all I wanted to do was introduce these concepts. There are many, many places to learn more. The Mozilla Developers Network is the best place in my view for many reasons. It has tremendously fantastic tutorials. And here are some links to some pieces in that tutorial. In addition to the tutorials, it has the canonical reference material for every HTML element and CSS rule. And so you may be wanting to learn how to do some CSS stuff for your assignment. Every proposed and current CSS rule is listed on this page, to which I'm linked, and there should be a full explanation of how to use it. Okay, I'm going to record a few more videos, but let's end this one here.